Hi. Right now, I'd like to talk about other European powers here in the New World, in particular France. At the same time John Smith and the Jamestown settlers are setting up camp in Virginia, France is also building permanent settlements here in the New World of their own. Samuel de Champlain will lead a group of French colonists throughout the mouth of the St. Lawrence River to find Quebec in 1608. In fact, the French are really interested in furs. The fur trade is very lucrative, and in fact, the French will move deeper and deeper into North America in search of the very lucrative pelt that can make so many things like coats and things like that. In addition, the French will also send over Jesuit missionaries who will boldly penetrate the wilderness in hopes of converting Native Americans to Catholicism. In fact, by 1700, France had laid claim to a very expansive territory that ranges from Newfoundland in the northeast down across the Great Lakes through the Ohio Valley and southward along the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico, and actually as far west as the Rocky Mountains. From this map, you can kind of see how the blue is France and it kind of dwarfs the British colonies. But I do want to stress that this is purely in territory only. Population-wise, the British colonies have a lot more people than the French. If you want to remember what I said, that it's fur trappers that are traveling throughout the blue areas claimed by France. So not major population centers like we're going to have in the British colonies. Towards the lower left-hand corner of that, or lower left hand, you can see Spanish, and we'll know Spain in their foray here into the New World, i.e., Mexico, Central America, and North America. Let's talk about the French Indian War, also known as the Seven Years' War. The French Indian War is basically a global struggle between England and France, which begins in 1754. Although, if you know your world history, we always know England and France are always at odds with each other. So, this is not something that's out of the ordinary. This war begins in America. French and British soldiers will butt heads with each other over control of the Ohio Valley. If you remember the map earlier, the French and the British colonies kind of butt up against each other in the Ohio River Valley. And of course, whenever you have two different nations on each other's boundary, there's going to be some sort of friction, and we do have it here. And at stake is that lucrative fur trade I mentioned, and access to that all-important valley, the lifeline of the frontier to the west. Uh, a squadron of soldiers led by a brash, unknown 22-year-old, you may recognize the name George Washington, uh, will be attacked by a French stronghold. Uh, the name of base is called Fort Duquesne, and in fact, George Washington will attack this French fort, Fort Duquesne. Soon after the attack, Washington's troops are actually forced to surrender, so it's an utter disappointment. So our founding father actually loses miserably in attacking Fort Duquesne. Shortly after that, a second British force will also meet with defeat. When the news of this reaches London, war, of course, is declared and the actual conflict begins. The first phase of the French Indian War is a sheer disaster for Britain. Assaults on French territory, will end in bitter defeat. So the British are not very good. The British and British colonists, right? They're losing every attack on the French. The French and their Indian allies, and that's why it's called the French Indian War, the French and the Indian allies, actually inspire fear on the British frontier here in the New World. They're known for burning and pillaging settlements. In fact, the French struck within 60 miles of Philadelphia. Americans are very disheartened and scared, for lack of a better word. And they really blame the British government. They believe that Britain is not making the proper commitment to North America. The turning point in this war actually comes when William Pitt uh, takes over wartime operations. William Pitt, he believes that North America is critical for England's global domination, just critical. And he will commit more troops and he will actually juggle the command replacing those old British war heroes from past wars and skirmishes with more, well, with younger ones. And in fact, he starts to realize, or he actually realizes that uh, he needs a different type of tactic. He actually needs people that know the territory here in the New World as opposed to stuffy old British officers that aren't familiar with this terrain. He, in fact, will turn over recruitment and supplies over to local authorities in America, and he will promise to reimburse them for their efforts. The military tide will turn with these American-born British colonists, military leaders that know the terrain, know how to fight, and know what to do. And in fact, in one of your readings, Benjamin Franklin talks about how the British military they don't listen to the locals, and of course they get utterly defeated in many cases. In fact, the tide has turned. The French chapter of North American history will end. Uh, the war actually ends with the Treaty of Paris of 1763. I don't want you to get too hung up on Treaty of Paris because there's going to be several throughout history. It's for some reason we always have our Treaty of Paris treaties signed in Paris, and we have Treaty of Paris fill in the year. But the impact is pretty profound. The Treaty of Paris, the terms are very harsh to France, the loser. In fact, all French territory on the mainland of North America is lost. The British received Quebec and that Ohio River Valley I mentioned earlier. And in fact, the port of New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi are given to Spain for their efforts as a British ally. So Spain was an ally of Britain during this war. So they get a taste of the victory. It should have really been a time to revel in the spoils of war. The colonists should have been super happy. The war is won. But instead, the very victory that temporarily brought American colonists close together and their British cousins helping to fight the French and the Indians will actually tear them apart in the end. We all know there's nothing like fear to make a group of people feel closer to a protector, right? That the colonists needed Great Britain makes because of the Native Americans and the French threat. But now that the war's over, that fear is gone, or that common enemy is gone. The colonists no longer feel threatened by France peering over their shoulders. With France gone, they could be free to chart their own destinies. This is how the colonists are starting to think. In addition, the experience of the French and Indian War did not in many ways bring the British and Americans closer together. In fact, British troops will look down their nose at the colonists. Americans are regarded as crude, lacking culture, just not as good as as the British. And in fact, the pious New Englanders, the church-going New Englanders I talk about, they find the British redcoats, their regular soldiers, to be very profane and crude. So not really going to be bonding moments between regular army British and American colonists. The methods of fighting during this war are very different between the colonials and the British Army. The colonials know that you need to fight Indian-style guerrilla tactics in this war. Need to fight in the brush, in the trees, while the British are very oriented in order, march in formation for their bayonet charges. Uh, so kind of different styles of fighting. The organization of military, the colonials are more into colonial militias. They just serve under their own captains. In fact, the majority of times they're going to know their captains. They probably live next door to them or live next to them. As opposed to the British officers wanted to take charge of the colonies. They wanted to be in charge, very orderly, like I mentioned. Discipline. The colonials have no military deference or protocols observed. They really are not very disciplined. They do it at their own way. Uh, just totally different than the British, who are very drill oriented, tough, disciplined, in line, being severely punished if you don't march correctly, as opposed to the colonials, which are very not that. Uh, they really don't believe in that hierarchy. Now, great fighters, and they know how to fight in the terrain, but total opposites of the British and their discipline-oriented methods. The finances. Colonials during this time resist any taxes. We still see that today, right? That Americans hate taxes. The colonials especially despise taxes. especially from the British. And now we're not going to talk about taxation without representation yet, but we start to see the colonials start to resist taxes. Uh, Now the British will say that the colonists need to pay their fair share of these taxes because it's for their own defense. Now, that's going to be something that's not going to be applicable after the war because colonists are going to say, well, the French are gone and we can handle the Native Americans. Once again, we start to see a distinction between colonials, the colonists, and the British. Uh, and in fact, some of that intercolonial rivalry is starting to break down, meaning the colony of Massachusetts and the colony of Virginia, once they were kind of competing in the grand scheme of things, but now they start to see themselves as colonists as opposed to Virginians solely and people from Massachusetts and other colonies. So we start to see them come together as colonials. And in fact, this is known as nationalism. The first signs of nationalism where settlers from all 13 colonies laid down their lives during this war and start to see it's us versus them. All could share in this pride. So I would like to stress that in many ways, the French and Indian War was a coming of age for the English colonies. They had a century of established history, they have a flourishing economy, and now they have a commonality in fighting in this French Indian War. But then, of course, also seeing them being distinct from their British cousins. Oh, and one last thing, the demeanor of the army. I left that out here, but it's on the slide. The colonials, they're very casual, non-professional, which I think I've kind of made that point earlier. While the British prima donnas, the officers with their servants, their officers drinking tea at certain times and having servants, uh, totally not the colonial style. Now, the effects of the war on Britain, these are important. I do want you to remember that. So after the French Indian War, we start to see, of course, Britain's empire is growing and growing, especially with all the land that the French had to give up in the Treaty of Paris. So the colonial empire increases dramatically. Now, with that increase, wars cost money. We all know that. And England goes into debt during the many wars that it's involved with as being a colonial power, an empire, right? So England is in debt, and it really is looking not to get involved in anything further. No more wars would be England's mantra at this time. Also, we start to see Britain's contempt for the colonials creating bitter feelings. I mentioned the military, how British officers or British soldiers look down on the colonials and the colonial militias and the colonial soldiers. It's just you're starting to see uh, these feelings of being better by the British start to create bitter feelings by the colonists, that they start to push back and say, you're not that much better than us, or you're not better than us at all. So we start to see bitter feelings. We start to see colonials coming together, having their own national pride. In fact, we're going to see with these three things, the colonial empire of Great Britain increasing so much, it being in debt, this contempt that the colonials feel from Britain and creating their own bitter feelings. We see England feeling a need to reorganize the American empire. It's necessary because they want to make sure and keep everything together. We see this come together with the Proclamation of 1763. In a nutshell, it's the king has created a dividing line, a proclamation line, and this map is really, really good. And you can see the colonies here. The proclamation line of 1763 primarily does two things. It keeps the Native Americans west of that line. You can see the Indian Reserve west of that line, and it keeps the colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, the Appalachian Mountains are where the line is. The king, what he's trying to do is he's trying to keep the colonists and the Native Americans separate because he doesn't want to have another war start. Now, if you're a colonist, you're upset about this because you fought the war, you fought the Native Americans, you fought the French, you've won this war, and now the king's telling you you can't go west of this line to find more land, to find your piece of the pie. Who's the king to tell me I can't travel
west. Soldiers, the spoils of war go to you, or so the thinking is. Here, the king is saying, no, colonists, you need to stay east of this line. Do not mess with the Indians. Uh, and he doesn't do this for purely altruistic reasons, meaning just because he's a good human being, he doesn't want anyone to fight. No, he's doing it because England is in debt and he doesn't want to have another war on his hands. He's trying to keep these two parties apart. Now, colonists, of course, like I said, are upset that they fought this war, they've maybe lost loved ones, or they've been injured, they're wounded, and now the king in Great Britain is telling us, hey, we can't go west of this line. We can't go west of the Appalachian Mountains because you're protecting the Indians. No, 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 no. We want land, and the land that we want is west of the Proclamation Line. And so this is going to create some animosity and continued um, adding on those bitter feelings, right? You keep on poking the bear, the colonists. So the Americans, the colonists, they had proved they can work together in the French Indian War, the 7 Years' War, uh, and we all know what's going to happen. Pretty soon, they're going to have to prove it again.
Now, I do want to stress there are differences, profound differences between the New England colonies and New France. The English colonies, though smaller in area, they actually will dwarf the French colonies in regard to population. King Louis XIV, he's a devout Catholic, and he will tolerate no other faiths within the French Empire. In fact, the religious minority in France, the Huguenots, they have no reason to come over to the New World and seeking religious freedom because King Louis wouldn't allow it. So there's no reason for them to come over. Much differently than, remember we talked about the Puritans and Pilgrims coming over for their religious freedom. The French have no reason to do so. In addition, France is not a major issue in, I'm sorry, land is not a major issue in France like it is in England. France is a lot bigger than England. So the French peasants really don't have an economic incentive to leave to find their own land because there is more land in France than in England. And we talked about indentured servants earlier coming over to and seeking their fortune. In fact, the French crown is really more interested in their Far East and Sugar Island holdings in the Caribbean than they are settlement in North America. Now, the English colonies are also different because they actually self-rule to an extent, and they will seek this right, this privilege, immediately upon arrival here. We talked about the Mayflower Compact earlier. The people of New France have no such privileges, no self-rule. In fact, decisions in New France, here in the New World, are made by local magistrates on behalf of the French king. Trial by jury does not exist for the French. And in fact, the French citizenry depends directly on the crown for guidance, while the English colonists here kind of depend on themselves. In the end, despite huge claims to North American lands, as we saw in the map earlier, the French are actually overwhelmed by the numerous self directed subjects of Britain.